The last sample that I have for you demonstrates how you can create a validation utility module. And in this case, I have it hooking in with Bootstrap. Now, if you haven't had a chance to work with Bootstrap, I greatly recommend it. It makes the process of building a website and dealing with layout issues much easier than starting from scratch. In fact, if you have yet to look into it, I highly recommend Scott Allen's Bootstrap course here on Pluralsight. Now, the way this will work is that this form is much like the one we've been working with in the past, except now when I go to validate it, you'll see that I have this nice popover that shows up over the input element. As I go in and enter in a value that fulfills the rule that's associated with this input element, the validation passes and it goes to the next one. So now my email address is required, so I can just put in test@test.com. But if I were to clear these out, you'll notice what happens is when I go to validate, only one message is being shown at a time. This helps keep the UI clutter-free, and it makes it easy for people to see what the next step they need to take in order to validate the form. The other thing that's nice about using Bootstrap for this is that the popover that shows up over the input element shows up directly where the user needs to change the input. Sometimes validation messages are put in unordered lists somewhere on the page and it can be difficult to find, so this tends to work well. Now, before I begin explanation of the JavaScript, let's take a moment to look at the markup required in order to make this validation module work correctly. So this is the HTML markup used in order to create that form on the page. So you notice I'll begin by declaring a form, which has the ID of email-form. And then I have two input elements. The first one is an input text of type because this is the username, and I've given it a value for ID and name. Now, just as you've seen in the other examples, I've used a pattern here to enforce an alpha-only username. I've added a placeholder so it's easy for users to understand what needs to go in that box, and then max length, the required attribute, and then a little bit of extra here as well. The first thing I'm doing is adding a data-attribute for role. And I'm saying that the role for this element is to have validation happen against it. So the module will look for any input element on the page that has the role of validate, and it will attempt to validate against that item. I've added title in here, and this is what shows up in the popovers title. This is a convention from Bootstrap. And also a Bootstrap convention, I've created data-content and added in the message that needs to show up in the popover. So the intent of this validation module is to be able to allow validation to happen with very little JavaScript on the page, because the module will take responsibility of hooking into the validation events and making sure that the validation messages show up on the screen appropriately. For email, again, this has data-role of validate, the title of email, and data-content for email address is required. The last bit of markup that I need in order to allow this form to work correctly is a button to trigger validation. So this button gets a data-role of trigger validation. The validation module will look for any elements that have the role of trigger validation in order to hook into its events to validate the form.